I first saw the portrait on a wet afternoon in October 2017 in the back storeroom of the Whitby Museum. The box that contained it wasn't even part of the official archive. It had been marked miscellaneous donation, unprocessed. I only opened it because the lid was soft with water damage, the cardboard buckling like skin. Inside were folded documents, a baptism certificate, a torn ledger, a child's ribbon pressed flat between brittle newspaper. Beneath them lay the photograph. It was large, printed on thick sepia paper mounted to board, the kind of formal studio composition typical of the 1880s. A family of 6 arranged with perfect symmetry. Father standing, mother seated with a baby in her lap, 3 other children posed in stiff Victorian obedience. Their expressions were calm, but not natural, the composure of people who'd been told to hold, still long past comfort. The baby caught my attention first. It was dressed in white lace, the folds so bright they almost glowed against the mother's dark dress. But the longer I looked, the more the child's face unsettled me. Not its stillness. Photographic exposure times then required children to stay motionless, but something about the eyes. They didn't reflect the light correctly. Both irises were too flat, too opaque, like coins pressed into dough. I leaned closer. The eyes had been painted on. At first, I assumed it was hand coloring, common in the 19th century, when photographers touched up prints to restore life to fading features. But these weren't subtle retouches. The brushwork was visible under magnification, the pigment glossy and new compared to the surrounding tones. Someone had deliberately painted over the child's closed eyelids, crafting a faint illusion of wakefulness. The longer I studied it, the more the illusion crumbled. The baby's mouth sagged slightly open, the head tilted just enough to betray gravity. The pose wasn't one of fidgeting life. It was one of surrender. It took me a few minutes to understand what I was really looking at. The baby had been dead when the portrait was taken. I'd read about post-mortem photography before, of course. It was a documented Victorian custom, especially among families who couldn't afford painted memorials. But I'd never seen one in person that was so poorly disguised, so obviously staged to deny what it was. This photograph wasn't about remembrance. It was about refusal. I turned the mount over. The back bore a faded studio stamp, A. H. Pennington, York, 1885. Below it, a faint, handwritten note. For Mother, to keep her still. That phrasing, it lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. To keep her still. It could have referred to the child or to the mother. I wasn't sure which disturbed me more. The next morning, I requested the museum's permission to conduct a preservation assessment. The curator, a cheerful man who specialized in maritime exhibits, waved it off. "That box came from a house clearance outside Whitby," he said. "Early donation, no paperwork. Take it if you want. It's not part of any collection." So I did. For a week, the photograph sat on the desk in my flat, resting against a pile of acid-free backing boards. I studied it under different light conditions, taking digital scans at various resolutions. In daylight, the family appeared ordinary, solemn, neatly dressed, frozen in time. But under artificial light, particularly the cool hue of my desk lamp, the tones shifted. The baby's dress seemed to brighten, while the others dulled, as though its whiteness was reflecting a light source no longer present. By the 5th night, I noticed something else. When magnified at high resolution, the left pupil, painted though it was, contained a faint reflection. Not of the photographer, as one might expect, but of a small, irregular shape beside the camera's lens. It looked like the corner of a mirror. A mirror shouldn't have been there. Portrait studios in the 1880s relied on diffused natural light, not reflective equipment, yet the reflection was unmistakable. It was then that I began tracing the Pennington Studios' history. Arthur Henry Pennington opened his photographic practice in York in 1872. He'd started as a traveling portraitist, setting up temporary booths at fairs before securing a permanent location on Stonegate. His clientele were mostly families, clergymen, and the occasional visiting dignitary. His surviving works, roughly 24 catalogued images, were all conventional, all except one. The Whitby Museum portrait wasn't listed in any register, nor mentioned in the surviving correspondence held at the York Historical Society. But in the archives of the Yorkshire Herald, I found a curious advertisement from January 1886. A. H. Pennington respectfully announces his retirement from photography. The recent misfortune at his premises compels him to withdraw from business indefinitely. He thanks his patrons for their custom. There were no further details. The misfortune intrigued me enough to visit York. Pennington's studio had long since become a tea room, but the City Records Office still held his property deeds. There, buried among tax receipts and sales notices, I found a single page that changed everything. It was a police report dated December 1885. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Mr. Arthur Pennington, photographer, was discovered by neighbors in a state of distress, claiming he had seen them move. Investigation revealed a broken plate negative upon the studio floor and a small fire in the developing room. No injuries recorded, though the subject was deemed unfit for further questioning. Attached was a note from the constable. Recommend observation. The man speaks of eyes that were open when they should not have been. I sat there in the records office, the air buzzing from the overhead lights, feeling a cold line travel down my spine. Pennington had seen the same eyes. That night in my flat, I opened the digital scan again. I enlarged the section showing the painted irises until the pixels broke apart into tiny squares of grey. Then, gradually, I pulled back just enough for the image to reform, and I saw it. The baby's pupils weren't symmetrical. The left one contained that faint reflection of a mirror. The right one contained something else, an outline, small but distinct, of another face. Not the photographer's, not a parent's. It was too close, too pressed to the surface, like a reflection of someone looking out from inside the lens itself. I sat motionless, staring at the monitor until my tea went cold. It would have been easy to dismiss as pareidolia, that human habit of seeing meaning in randomness. But something in me resisted that explanation. The eyes weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone had painted them after the photograph was taken. Someone had added that face. The Pennington family portrait, I later learned, was commissioned by a couple named Thomas and Edith Holloway. Their names appeared in a baptism register from the village of Rosedale, a rural parish 20 miles from Whitby. They'd had 5 children, the youngest, Agnes, born in March 1885. Agnes's death certificate was dated November of the same year. Cause: respiratory failure following influenza. Age: 8 months. 2 weeks later, the family sat for a portrait. The realization left a knot in my throat. I imagined the mother, still swollen with grief, dressing her dead infant in white lace and carrying her into a photographer's studio. I imagined the other children staring, confused, at their sister's motionless form. The father, stoic, determined to hold composure. Post-mortem photography was rare by the 1880s, but not unheard of in rural communities. Yet this felt different. The Holloways weren't trying to memorialize the dead. They were pretending she wasn't. When I finally visited Rosedale, the air carried the smell of peat and old wood smoke. The churchyard lay quiet under a low winter sun, its stones worn illegible by wind. After a half-hour of searching, I found a small slate marker near the edge of the property. Agnes Holloway, born March 2nd, 1885. Died November 10th, 1885. Sleep still, little one. The inscription struck me. Sleep still. As if she hadn't. I almost laughed at myself. Almost. Then I heard something. A low hum, faint as breath, coming from inside the church. It was only when I stepped closer that I realized it wasn't a sound, but the wind slipping through the old stone aperture. Still, for a second, it felt like a voice. That night, back in Whitby, I dreamed of the photograph. Only this time, the baby's head tilted upward, and the eyes, those painted, artificial eyes, blinked. I returned to my flat that night with the photograph in my satchel and the feeling that I'd made some kind of mistake. Not a professional one, an existential one. I'd been trained to preserve, not to pry. But from the moment I found the inscription, "For Mother, to keep her still," I couldn't stop thinking about what that meant. Sleep still. Keep her still. The wording followed me everywhere. By the next morning, I'd gathered every accessible record tied to the Holloway family. Their parish had burned down in 1902, taking most birth and death registries with it, but the local paper, the Whitby Gazette, kept a short obituary. The Holloways of Rosedale mourn the loss of their youngest, Agnes, aged 8 months. Her passing was quiet, her mother holding her in arms as dawn broke. There was a second mention, months later, almost invisible among the small notices. Mr. and Mrs. T. Holloway request privacy in light of recent illness, Dr. Baines attending. The line struck me because of its timing. Late December 1885, barely 6 weeks after Agnes's death and the date of the portrait. The family had fallen ill after the photograph was taken. I found the doctor's ledger next, hidden in a local archive under Baines' rural visits. Most of the entries were routine: pneumonia, fever, childbirth. But one note caught my eye. December 30th, Rosedale. Mrs. Holloway exhibits symptoms of melancholia and fixed delusion. Believes infant not deceased. Requests I return to bless nursery window nightly. Husband exhausted, children frightened. Recommending isolation and rest. Another, 2 days later. House reeks of spirit varnish. Photograph displayed prominently on mantel. Woman claims the eyes have followed her back. Recommends removal. I remember reading that line again and again, the edges of the page soft beneath my thumb. The eyes have followed her back. It wasn't a metaphor. When I enlarged the scan of the photograph again that evening, I saw something that hadn't been there before. The painted irises had deepened, darkening at the edges as though the pigment were bleeding outward. I checked my earlier files. The change wasn't from the scanning process. The image had altered. At first I blamed light exposure or color drift, but by the third day, even the print itself seemed heavier. I caught myself turning it face down whenever I wasn't working, an instinct I couldn't rationalize. On the fourth night, I dreamed vividly. I stood in the Holloway's parlor, the smell of oil paint sharp and sweet. Mrs. Holloway was sitting in a straight-back chair, the dead child on her lap, its small head rolling slightly with each brushstroke as she worked. The room was dark, save for the photographer's lamp glowing amber in the corner. "Just one more layer," she whispered. Her husband stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, not in comfort but in restraint. When she looked up at me, her eyes weren't her own anymore. They were the baby's, painted open, wet and glinting with that unnatural sheen. I woke to the sound of something tapping the glass of the picture frame. I told myself it was the radiator, or condensation. Anything but what it sounded like. Tiny fingernails clicking from inside the image. I stopped sleeping after that. The next breakthrough came when I returned to York for Pennington's personal records stored in the county library. Among them was a series of letters addressed to his wife during his recovery at a private asylum in Scarborough. One letter, dated February 1886, read, "I can still hear her asking for the brush. The mother said it was her idea, but the husband insisted on it. He said she would never stop otherwise, that if we made the child look awake, she'd believe it. So I mixed the pigment as they watched, ochre, soot, and my own varnish. and I painted the eyes. But when I turned away, I swear I heard a sigh, not from the mother, from the baby. Pennington's handwriting trembled near the end. They asked for the negative after. I refused. I had already smashed it. But they took the glass shards home in a box, said they would bury her properly this time. The same glass, I realized, that reflected in the baby's pupil. The story might have ended there, one more Victorian tragedy born of grief and superstition, if not for what happened when I took the photograph to the conservation lab. It was late January, cold and wet. The lab technician, a friend named Clara, helped me set up the ultraviolet scanner. She was pragmatic, a woman who laughed at ghost stories. But when the first UV sweep passed over the child's face, she frowned. "There's a secondary layer," she said. She adjusted the filter, and faint lettering appeared across the baby's dress, almost invisible in normal light. It looked like writing scraped into the emulsion before drying. 2 words. "Wake up." Clara's hand froze on the console. "You did that?" "No," I whispered. She looked at me. "Then someone else did." After the photograph was printed, we both stared as the image flickered faintly on the screen. The child's outline blurred, then settled again, but its eyes, those painted eyes, seemed glossier, more alive. The next second, the lab lights went out. When they came back on, the monitor showed static. The scanner had crashed. Clara was pale. "The backup power should have held," she murmured, pressing buttons that did nothing. I didn't move. The printed photograph lay beneath the UV lamp, the baby's face half lit, and for a brief, sickening instant, the eyes seemed to catch the light and reflect it back, not as glass, but as something wet. We shut everything down. That night, I brought the photograph home again, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe part of me wanted to protect it, or maybe I wanted to see what it would do next. By dawn, the words "wake up" had vanished. It was about this time that I began hearing the sound, a faint, rhythmic thump behind the wall where the photo hung. At first, I thought it was the pipes, but it moved, a soft, dragging sound that traveled from one corner to the next. On the 7th night, I woke to find the photograph on the floor, face down. The frame's glass was unbroken, but the backing paper had split open, revealing something pressed inside, a small square of cloth, stiff with age. I unfolded it carefully. It was a child's bib, hand-stitched with the name Agnes. Beneath it, faint smudges of red-brown dust, pigment, ochre, and soot. The same mixture Pennington had described. After that, I couldn't stay in the flat. Every shadow seemed to hold the glint of those painted eyes. So I took the photograph and drove back to Rosedale, to the Holloway property, or what remained of it. The farmhouse was little more than stone walls and nettles, the roof long gone. The air was sharp, metallic, and still. Inside the ruin, I found fragments of glass scattered in the hearth, perhaps remnants of that smashed negative. I crouched to look closer, and something shifted beneath the debris. It was a child's shoe, half buried in soot. The leather was blackened, but a small brass buckle still gleamed. I don't know what compelled me, but I picked it up. It was warm. When I looked toward the doorway, the light had changed. The winter sun outside dimmed as though a cloud had swallowed it, and for a heartbeat the air hummed, low, almost imperceptible, like the resonance of a struck string. And then I saw her. The child, standing in the threshold, her dress grey with dust, her head tilted, her painted eyes glistening. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The sound that left my throat wasn't quite a scream. I dropped the shoe and stumbled backward until I hit the far wall. The figure remained there, not fading, not flickering, perfectly still, like the photograph itself had stepped into life. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not with her mouth, but with her eyes. a ripple, a shimmer beneath the paint, as if the pigment itself were bending toward me. The last thing I remember before blacking out was that whisper I'd read so many times. Sleep, still. When I woke, it was daylight again. The photograph was gone. At first I thought I'd dreamed it, but my hands were streaked with soot and ochre, the same colors Pennington mixed. The local authorities found me later, wandering along the Moor Road. I told them I'd been researching local history. They didn't ask more. Back in Whitby, I filed my report with the museum and turned over everything. The bib, the papers, even the scans. I told them the photograph was lost, but it wasn't. It's here, beside me now, in a plain black frame. The baby's eyes look the same as ever, except when the room goes dark. Then, faintly, the paint seems to shimmer. And if you look closely enough, you can see a reflection forming inside the pupils. It isn't a mirror this time. It's my face, and every night, it moves just a little closer.